originally largely a grassland, which goes against that sort of story, that had to be crushed, wasn't it?
The book challenged assumptions and angered those that needed the Pilliga to be ancient and keep it morally untouchable. And foresters never argue that. But it gives you plenty more options about trying to deal with a fire, particularly under severe fire weather conditions, as we leave these forests to benign neglect and not active management, is that we're seeing some consequences of that.
Hello, today we have the fascinating story of a forest that grew up and drove men out. It's an incredible story. It goes back to the time of the Aboriginals, when an area of forest, a large area of forest, in fact, was originally grassland. It became a forest. Then they had rabbit plagues, which changed the forest. And then we had koala plagues, and the rabbits die out from myxomatosis. And then finally, we had the academics arrive. This is an area called the Pilliga Forest in New South Wales. It's an area that was originally explored by John Oxley in 1818. And I've got a fabulous forester expert to tell us all about it, a guy called Robert Onfray, who's done blogs. He's an author and a forester of many years. Robert, thanks for coming and joining us.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this wonderful forest.
Back in 1818, what was the story with this area, the Pilliga Forest?
Well, it was just like a lot of inland Australia beyond the Great Dividing Range. Oxley, Mitchell, they all wrote about the same thing. They discovered this vast area of open woodlands with the native grasses, which was just ideal for all the grazing. They didn't have to clear forests or anything like that. And they were quite effusive about their writing about it because it was what they were looking for.
Right. So this area which we now call the Pilliga Forest was a grassland. I think I just checked out beforehand. The Pilliga Forest is about 100 kilometers long and 50 kilometers across. It's about half the area of Yorkshire in England. It's 1/6 of the area of Belgium. So this is actually a very large area, isn't it?
It is. It broadly occurs in a triangle between the towns of Barradine, Coonabarabran, and Narrabri. So if you travel on the Newell Highway, you get to see parts of the Pilliga scrub or the Pilliga forest. It's beyond the Liverpool Plains, so it's not in that real great fertile agricultural area, but it's, because of the abundant native grasses that were there at the time of settlement, it was just ideal for the grazing. So the settlers brought in their sheep and cattle and horses and so forth. We had figures of around 50,000 cattle and 30,000 sheep and 20,000 horses. You don't bring that into an area if you drive up the Newell Highway today and see wall to wall, cypress trees.
Okay. So the Pilliga now is a relatively thick forest. We'll put up some pictures of it. But actually, this whole story, this documentation of this massive change of the forest, actually was from a book by Eric Rolls, I think. In your blog, you talk about it, and he was the guy who sort of documented all of it, but ultimately got into a lot of trouble, didn't he, for writing this book?
Yeah, look, Eric spent a number of years putting this together. He lived in the area. He was a poet, a farmer, and a naturalist. And he basically wrote an environmental history of this area and famously called it a story of a forest which grew and drove the men out. Now, with that single phrase, he changed the moral framework of in Australian environmental storytelling. And for many, it has been unforgivable ever since, mainly because the book challenged assumptions and angered those that needed the Pilliga to be ancient and keep it morally untouchable. But the fact is, and through all Rolls didn't come from an ideological viewpoint. He came from old explorers' journals. He came from early survey records. He came from the settlers' records. He came from Royal Commission records. He came from forestry records and files, and put the story together about how this area wasn't a primordial forest that had to be, that was a remnant that we had to leave and set aside. It was actually an area that grew up since European settlement, and it's a fascinating story.
Yeah. Okay. So eventually, the Pilliga forest. Tell me the date. A lot of it became a national park with this sort of like myth that it was this massive forest that had to be protected from the dastardly foresters who were raping and pillaging it. And of course, the idea that, well, actually, no, it was originally largely a grassland, which goes against that sort of story, that had to be crushed, wasn't it? That's roughly what happened.
Yeah, I mean, the modern storytelling is about a wilderness. Now, it's a very strange wilderness when you have, stock roots and fences and evidence of ring barking and cattle grazing, stockyards and roads and all sorts of things like that. But just getting back, before we get to this idea of this place as being a wilderness, we need to go right back to about the 1870s.
Yep.
That is when, so the Aborigines, as part of the settlement, the Aborigines were displaced. So their traditional management of the area, where they used fire regularly to keep the place open for hunting and access and so forth, was removed. And part of that is an explosion in growth. The cypress doesn't like fire. It dies from fire. But when you get periods of wet weather, which you do get, a couple of years in a row with some flooding and wet weather, the cypress love it and they'll grow up. And so these settlers that had just come in the 1860s and so within a decade, they were starting to see these changes because they weren't carrying out the similar burning that the Aborigines were doing. They were bringing in assets, fencing, and so they didn't need to burn.
So the cypress pines are these big tall trees, and they suddenly exploded where there was grassland where people were grazing cattle, and the cypress pine tends to be highly susceptible to fire. Is that the case? So
yeah,
the Aboriginal fires would have kept it under control.
Yeah. So cypress was in the landscape, but it just wasn't in this. I mean, the cypress can grow up thicker than the hairs on a cat's back. It can. There's been records showing that there's 1 million stems per hectare. It's so thick, and unlike eucalypts, the cypress has this ability to just keep growing. Eucalypts can self-thin, right? Cypress doesn't do that. They just stop growing. So there are cypress trees in the landscape with a diameter of about 2 centimeters that are about 100 years old. So they just stop growing and wait for some sort of disturbance, generally fire, that would open up, kill most of the trees and allow the remaining ones to grow. Now, we know, to get an idea of the picture of what the country was like in the 1870s, forest rangers, the earliest forest rangers, south of Narrabri, estimated the timber in the area, and they measured about two mature eucalypt trees per acre and about 10 young trees with scattered cypress. So this area was, this classic woodland sort of country with all these grasses. But things were thickening up. And by that, around the late 1870s, the government was actually issuing surveyors with orders to record all this growth because farmers were starting to complain and they were being told they had to do something about it. Now, no one knew why this was happening. It just was because the conditions were right. But the story took a major twist towards the 1890s when the rabbits arrived. Now, their arrival coincided with a number of wet years, so their numbers just exploded. And so these areas had become thick with all this cypress that could just grow up on a whim and was just sitting there. But it wasn't good for the cattle or any of the grazing. But the rabbits did a great job for them because they were hungry. They would ring bark, eat, and all these young seedlings. And so essentially what we had, we started getting this forest with trees from 1870 to 1890 cohort that had grown, and then there was nothing after that. Nothing, in fact, for 60 years until Myxomatosis came in. So
So myxomatosis was the disease that was introduced to kill rabbits.
yes, so Myxo came in 1950. It was the forerunner to the more recent Khaleesi virus, and it was very successful. But even well before that, at the turn of the century, because the graziers were just having a hellish time trying to keep on top of all this regrowth, a royal commission was held, and evidence after evidence from all these settlers painted this pretty dire picture in the in this area, and it basically became they just couldn't keep grazing the area. So the next phase that really came about was the forestry phase. So you had this area, this brand new forest that really could only be contained through some form of active management, and the way to do that was through the human. So from a forester's point of view, and from my point of view, it was a godsend for us. We had this opportunity because cypress is one of the best timbers in the world. I mean, it's resistant to certainly construction timber. It's resistant to termites. And it's a softwood, but it's one of the hardest softwoods out there. It's a remarkable timber. A lot of, you know, the first house I bought, we pulled up the carpets, and lo and behold, beautiful cypress flooring underneath, and we just got it nicely polished. And there's many tales you hear from people about in their houses with the cypress flooring. So the next stage in the whole story, and you know, call me biased or whatever, but the most critical part of the story is what happened over the next century in terms of the active management in these forests, because you've got something that's a regenerated, fairly unstable sort of ecosystem that foresters were quite proud of, under the guidance of what we call the Don Bradman of foresters, Edward Swain. There was he brought in a sense of order into the forest.
Okay, so at the beginning of the right, so at the beginning of the 1900s, a properly managed forestry started to develop in the Pilliga forest. This guy, I've forgotten, Don Bradman, came along and started to use proper forestry practices, and a fairly well flourishing forestry industry developed in the Pilliga, say by between the two wars. Is that a bit of a summary?
Yeah, no, that's true. It wasn't until about the 1920s that order started coming in. The Forestry Commission was set up under the legislation in 1916. So yeah, between the war period and into the Depression, and the Depression provided opportunities where the government sponsored employment. So you had all these gangs of workers that were thinning out these thick, non-commercially thinning out all these thick areas of cypress and leaving behind the best ones to grow. And part of doing that was keeping, in conjunction with the rabbits that were still around, and the forest, the area was kept relatively clean underneath. And what that meant was there were no fires, so there was no experience in having the big wildfires that came later in the latter part of the century, which is a critical story because, as I said earlier, cypress does not survive fires, particularly the really heavy fires, right. Or the severe high intensity fires. So foresters, but the big concern in forestry was, they're basically managing these trees that were by that stage, 40, 50 years old. So they only grew up between 1870 and 1890, thinning them out. As they were cutting these areas, and they did all these inventory plots, so they worked out a sustained yield cut, there was concern that because there was no regrowth coming up, because of the rabbits were still there, that the industry may not be sustained into the future. So this became a very critical issue during the 30s and 40s. Then we get the next twist in the whole story, the sting in the tail that changed things once again. And that was the myxomatosis. So nothing to do with forestry and forestry. It was just a coincidence that well, in some ways benefit forestry, other ways it didn't. But come 1950s, Myxomatosis is released, and then suddenly we're getting new regeneration coming up in these areas where foresters had opened up the canopy, the sunlight's coming in, beautiful looking forests. If you read my blog or even on my Facebook page, the photo I have at the feature image for the whole story, people are accusing me of just having a picture of a plantation. That's how so well managed this area was, you know. They weren't planted in rows. If you're looking carefully, you'll see that it wasn't. But foresters then suddenly got a new problem. And that problem was a massive wildfire in 1952. So they get this explosion in growth and they're scratching their heads going, shit, what do we do, you know?
Yeah, Robert, so the explosion of growth was now cypress pines, little saplings, little baby things, was it? Or was it everything was just growing up in the lower
look, it
understory?
would have been other things, but the rapid, the dense growth was the cypress taking off again like it did in the 1870s and 80s in that previous cohort. So we're now seeing a landscape without the rabbits, right? So back to when it was 60, 70 years ago, except there was a bit more, you know, order to the forest. But foresters stand around scratching their head going, on the one hand, oh, great, we're getting regeneration, we're going to have a resource into the future, but we're going to have to manage it and do something about it. And they were forced into doing something about it very quickly afterwards when probably one of the biggest wildfires in the Pilliga's history, in its short history, occurred in 1952. And because there was all this fuel suddenly in the forest that the foresters and forest workers hadn't had to deal with in their lifetime, you know, since 1890, basically. And so it was a totally new thing, you know. So they instituted, you know, hazard reduction burning, reintroduced the thinning out of the forests and try to bring order back in again. So during the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of intense silvicultural work, what we call stand improvement works, which, you know, tried to space out the trees and get the biggest and best growing trees for the future. So that was by the 70s that we had developed a great silvicultural system, and we were back on track with a sustained yield. We had a resource going into the future, and things were looking quite rosy until we get basically from the 1970s a bit of a city-centric viewpoint about the whole landscape that
so this is when this is sort of the birth of the sort of the environmental movement. Forests are good, and we all agree forests are good, but the idea that we could have a forestry industry in this wonderful pristine forest which is 50,000 years old according to some of the academics, well, you can't have that. So this is where the next big change comes in, the sort of completely different mindset and totally denying the past happened there with the university academics, I suspect. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, we basically fell in love with a dangerous idea that all our forests are timeless and what we see today has always existed. That may be the case with, you know, our rainforests and so forth elsewhere in Australia, but for the Pilliga and you know, there's other areas that Pilliga's not just the only example. The river red gum forests on the Murray are another example of more recent forests that have come up that people believe are some primordial, mythical forest that needs special attention. So this idea of human intervention, which had been carried on since the 1950s in particular in these forests, was harming the natural world and had to be stopped. So the pressure, you know, some academics started writing some papers that said that, you know, Eric Rolls was wrong, you know, that this dense cypress forest existed before European settlement. The thing was, their evidence was and they quoted John Oxley, but Oxley talked about having to struggle through some thick cypress forest in a totally different landscape, the riverine landscape along the Murrumbidgee and the Lachlan rivers, totally different to the
Yeah.
Pilliga itself. And in fact, Eric Rolls recognised that in his book, and he talked about Oxley walking through those areas in prior to 1870, well, the early part of that 19th century. So, Rolls was in the firing gun again, just as, this movement for preservation took hold. And it in the 60s, late 60s, I think it was 67, the area of the Pilliga. So the Pilliga is really in two parts. The flow of the old river systems had deposited the deep sands in the northwest area of the Pilliga, which is where the better trees are and the concentration of the forestry activities. In the southern eastern sections, we had it wasn't as productive and wasn't as managed as intensively. So, that was the first area to get reserved. It was actually a vacant Crown land area and became a nature reserve. But we started seeing problems with that reservation. So while forestry wasn't active in there, they did have some fire breaks. They did keep an eye on it. They did try and do some sort of, it was lower key management. And we started getting some big fires in that area.
Right. So the idea of nature protection is often, you can't have fires because fires will kill trees. But of course, especially with things like cypress pines, you do need a low intensity burn periodically. Not enough to sort of kill the trees if it gets up into the crown. So they made it into a nature reserve, but did they actually sort of send things backwards in that way?
Well, yes. I mean, we started seeing these large wildfires occur in the area, and we've continued to see it. So the problem was exacerbated in about 2005 under Bob Carr as Premier. Bob Carr wanted to leave a legacy, and he decided his legacy should be considered as the greenest Premier in New South Wales history. This was his token to his people in the inner cities, and who were his biggest supporters and where he got his most votes. So he converted a lot of areas of state forest in the state to national parks, over 1 million hectares, including 350,000 hectares of the 500,000 hectares of the Pilliga scrub to national park, because he was taken by this concept of wilderness. The koalas had become the totemic animal for the area. Their numbers had grown over the years, despite the trashing of the forest by forestry and so forth.
So can we just stop there, because the koalas is an interesting story, isn't it? Because presumably right at the beginning, before British settlement, there would have been a few koalas in the sort of the tree thickets and this type of stuff, maybe along the river banks. But then as the forestry came along, presumably the koalas exploded in number. There's some word you use in your blog for what koalas can do. They can actually become in a really large number of proportions.
Yeah, the koalas are an eruptive species. So a bit like the kangaroos, they explode in numbers during the good times, and during the harsh times, particularly droughts and severe wildfires, they drop in numbers. Now, what we've seen after the 2019 and 20 bushfires, the devastating fires that roared through a lot of forests and killed the canopy, that's been great to the koalas since, because we've had a dense regrowth of eucalypts, and koalas.
So did you say that's
leaves.
great? Did you say that
Yeah.
was great for the koalas? That the bushfire was great for koalas?
Surely
they all got smoked in the bushfire, didn't they?
Oh yeah, they numbers would have dropped with severe areas that were severely scorched and that, but they've come back in great numbers now. And this is what the green activists won't admit, because their narrative is that, for them to get any legitimacy to their argument, they've got to constantly argue that they're about to be endangered. But the inconvenient truth is that numbers at the moment are exploding, but the next drought they'll drop. and they'll drop in the Pilliga as well. There's been some recent fires in the Pilliga that haven't been good for the forests, and they certainly haven't been good for the animals. And the concern that foresters have is their management has basically dwindled and been shut out as we leave these forests to benign neglect and not active management, is that we're seeing some consequences of that.
So how much of these forests is now, what percentage of the Pilliga is now open to forestry, and what percentage is national park or whatever else?
Well, it's 350,000 out of the 500,000 is in reserves. So
That's
what, 50,
you mean forestry reserve or nature reserve?
national parks and preservation reserves.
Yeah, okay.
And
So
effectively,
the
that's
great
not
majority
actively.
is okay. So the great
Yeah.
majority is now a national park in inverted commas. And generally speaking, if it's like most national parks, it's not properly managed in terms of fire management the way that the forestry would have done it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, these agencies still have a firefighting force, but it's their culture and the way they want to manage the forest. So the whole edict under current fire management is about dealing with a fire after it starts, not trying to deal with the causes of the fires, and in particular the fuel loads. Now, doing something about the fuels doesn't stop fires, right? And foresters never argue that. But it gives you plenty more options about trying to deal with a fire, particularly under severe fire weather conditions, or when the conditions abate during the night time, where you can try and actively do something about a fire. If you don't have that level of, you can wipe out a forest in a day on a severe, and we've seen it. We've seen it not only in the Pilliga but other areas.
Yeah. So this, I mean, if you look at this whole thing, I'm just going to try to summarize. We have a crazy situation where a forest was mostly declared a national park that was never a forest in the first place. And then we have the situation that this forest, which they desperately want to protect, which was never a forest, is now being improperly managed to keep it as a decent forest. It's going to probably have massive fires, which will go through, wipe out the koalas, who will then probably bounce back. And the whole thing is based on a myth or a lie, and frankly a slandering of what Eric Rolls's work had done. That we have these so-called experts in the universities, backed by the inner city people who just think that, well, forests are good, and that if there's a forest there, it must have always been a forest. The whole situation is just completely and absolutely crazy, denying the scientific evidence, as we seem to do in so many things. And we're going to go through a whole seesaw of changes in the future because this place is not being managed at all.
That's basically right. I mean, we've Australians find the Australians, and this is what frustrates foresters. Um, they find it hard to read time in our landscapes. So we compress centuries into moments and moments into myths, and so we're favouring this moral clarity over ecological truth, and we're bearing witness to that with what's happening in the Pilliga. Is not this primordial forest that's had no hand of man for centuries or millennia. It's a recent construct that needs that active management. Otherwise, we will get what we're seeing, and that is, it's not going to go back to the woodlands, or the cypress will still keep growing and they'll still keep burning out. But what's going to happen in between is all the animals are going to suffer. And there's a big suite of, for a forest that's so young, it's amazing all the bird species and reptile species and that are in the forest, and particularly the koalas, which is great to see. But people need to understand that their populations will increase and dive due to circumstances. But
I mean,
it's, if you drive through the Newell Highway now, it's not a great sight.
Yeah.
The recent fire in 2023 decimated another area of that forest.
Right, and
And
that's simply because of poor management, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that sort of strikes me about it is if you were just truthful and just say, look, yeah, it was mostly grassland and all these changes which Eric Rolls and you've documented, these are all true. And but say we really do like trees. We're losing forests all around the world, so it's not a bad thing that this area has gone from grassland to trees. I mean, that's an argument because maybe you don't want it to go back. Maybe you can't make it go back to its original thing. But it's this denying of the truth, denying of the evidence on the basis of ideology, and then keeping on doing that with the denying of what proper fire management is required in a normal Australian forest. It's the sort of, I don't know, it's just telling a lie about things, which inevitably is going to get you into trouble in the future. That to me seems to be the biggest problem here.
yeah, and to me, it's a metaphor for pretty much land and particular forest management in Australia at the moment. There's a real ignorance to how important active management is. I mean, our eucalypt forests are what we call disclimax communities. They cannot exist. They cannot perpetuate themselves without disturbance. Right? Now,
Right.
foresters, in trying to provide a resource in a balanced way for the community, so we have some sections of the communities that think, we shouldn't be doing it the way we have to do it, in cutting down trees, with the other parts of the community that crave this resource. So we've tried to find that balance in doing so, but we understand the ecology of the forests and what it needs. So protecting all these tall forests in Tasmania, for instance, is a good, noble cause, but it doesn't guarantee. I mean, foresters cannot understand the preoccupation that the public has in revering dead and dying trees. I mean, those trees are going to die, and they'll be without a big major fire or any disturbance like logging or anything, they will become a rainforest. Now, that's good if you love rainforests, but if you love those big regnant mountain ash trees, they're going to disappear.
Yeah,
And
we
that's the
have exactly the
paradox that
same.
people.
Mm. We have exactly the same problem up here in North Queensland. You have the boundary between the rainforests. You go through the wet sclerophyll forest into the dry sort of sclerophyll, and without the fires, the rainforest takes over the wet sclerophyll forest. And it's actually a very rare forest. There's usually only a band of maybe a kilometre or two between the dry sclerophyll and the rainforest. And as the rainforest marches through, because of the lack of fire regime, you lose these huge Eucalyptus grandis trees and various others. And it's all done, well, we can't have fires because fires are all bad. Um, it's not based on scientific evidence. And so would you say, I mean, we're getting a little bit off the Pilliga here. In terms of the general forestry management in Australia now, it seems to me that the way we just ban forestry, we misplace our fire management as well. It seems to me that the whole forest management in Australia is a complete disaster now in many respects. Would you reckon that's a fair comment?
Yeah, look, if the change to the land use that we've seen over millions of hectares, particularly from state forest into national parks, if that provided a great outcome for the forests, then we would be clapping our hands and cheering it on and saying that's great. But it isn't. And the evidence is there by what we see. I mean, a lot of people sit there and say the increase in mega fires that we've seen this century, particularly in Southeast Australia, is due to climate change is a cop-out because it's just trying to take that human agency out of the thing. So all these people responsible no longer have to have any accountability for their passive management that's, like I said, referred to earlier. Fire management is focused on dealing with the problem after the fire starts. That's too late. And it's
Yeah.
also, they're not aggressively attacking fires when they start, when the opportunity's there, because 80% of the fires, the 2019-20 fires, started a month before those really bad fire days on New Year's Eve, New Year's Day. They were going around for a month and weren't put out. So to sit there and say that it's all due with climate change and ignore all the other factors is doing a disservice not only to our forests, but, you know, to Australians, basically.
Yeah. No, it is a bit of a strange situation, isn't it? Well, anyway, Robert, thanks very much for a very interesting conversation about the Pilliga scrub, that it's completely not what most people think it is, that I think that there's probably a lot of other areas. And maybe I'll ask you this one final question. How many other areas, what sort of area would be in a similar situation where they were grassland and have gone back to forest? I know that in Western Queensland that you can see evidence of this. The early explorers reported just pure grass plains, and now there's maybe not very dense forest, but there's certainly a lot of forest. Is this a very common thing?
Yes, it is. I mentioned earlier about sections of the River Red Gum Forest. So there was a property called Yanga at Balranald, right on the Murray River, that was bought by Carr again, and he promised that the management of that area would be better under national parks. Well, the photos and what we're seeing down there, it doesn't show that. But what we do know is from the history of that area that when they put in some weirs and locks in that river and increased the flooding in the adjoining wetland areas, that the River Red Gum exploded in the 1940s and became a forest, which was being actively logged and managed by the landowners supplying local timber products, that suddenly stopped because people decided, hang on a minute, your management is so wonderful, but you're destroying it, and we have to save it. You know, that's the logic we put up with. I managed forests in northwest Tasmania, and I wrote my first book about an area of land that's got a fascinating pre-European and European history. And, you know, reading the early journals, it's become obvious that a lot of areas and mind you, we're talking about an area that has more than 2 meters of rainfall a year, and a climate that's very conducive to rainforests over the whole lot. But the fact that 30% of it was moorland, grassland, shrublands when Europeans arrived talks about the human occupation of that area for millennia. But we're finding that since Aborigines again have been displaced and not knowing how to manage the way they did, we're seeing areas being overtaken by forests and rainforests in particular in those areas. So there are plenty of examples around Australia.
Okay. Well, look, thanks very much. Now, Robert has written some books. We'll put those up on the screen at the end, and he also has a blog. Look at the description as well. So thanks very much, Robert. That was a fascinating discussion about the Pilliga scrub.
Thanks, Peter. Enjoyed it.